Tonight, we journey into one of history's most enduring mysteries. The rise and fall of the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, known to the world as the Knights Templar. For nearly 2 centuries, these warrior monks commanded respect and fear across Christendom, building an empire of stone and gold that stretched from the shores of the Holy Land to the remotest corners of Scotland and Portugal. They answered to no king, bowed only to the Pope, and accumulated wealth and secrets that still inspire seekers and scholars 900 years after their violent destruction. But the Templars we will explore tonight are not merely historical figures. They are doorways into questions that history cannot fully answer. What did 9 knights find beneath the Temple Mount during their years of mysterious excavation? How did an order sworn to poverty become the bankers of kings? What secrets did they carry from the East that their accusers would call heresy? And when the flames consumed the last Grand Master on that March evening in 1314, what knowledge perished with him? Or what knowledge escaped into the night, carried by brothers who fled the purge to distant shores? These questions have no certain answers. The Templars left few written records of their inner mysteries, and what records existed were largely destroyed in the flames of their suppression. What remains are fragments, trial testimonies extracted under torture, architectural traces in stone and symbol, legends that have grown like sacred vines around the ruins of historical fact. Tonight, we will walk among these fragments, not seeking to solve the mystery, but to inhabit it, to feel the weight of questions that have outlived those who first asked them. We will begin where the Templars began, in Jerusalem, in the aftermath of the First Crusade, when 9 men knelt in chambers beneath the Temple Mount and emerged, 9 years later, transformed. We will follow their rise from obscurity to power, their accumulation of wealth that defied their vows of poverty, their creation of networks that spanned continents. We will enter their rituals and their symbols, their commanderies and their ships, their castles that still stand against Mediterranean skies, and we will witness their fall. The dawn arrests of October 1307, the accusations of heresy and blasphemy, the torture chambers where confession was extracted drop by drop, the flames that consumed their leaders while crowds watched in silence. We will follow the treasure that vanished, the symbols that survived, the legends that grew in the centuries after their destruction. The pace will be gentle. The mysteries will unfold slowly, like secrets shared in whispered confidence. Some chapters will take us into sunlit commanderies, others into dungeon darkness. Some will explore documented history, others will venture into the shadows where history cannot reach, where only legend and possibility remain. All will carry the understanding that the Templars' greatest mystery may not be what they found or what they knew, but the silence they maintained, a silence that has echoed through 900 years and shows no sign of fading. So settle in. Let the weight of the day release, and prepare to journey into sacred chambers and forbidden knowledge, into the rise and fall of an order that still captures imagination, because it still holds secrets that imagination cannot fully grasp. The night deepens. The torches cast their wavering light. and we begin. In the year 1119, when Jerusalem still echoed with the memories of crusade, when the blood of conquest had barely dried on sacred stones, 9 men presented themselves before King Baldwin II with a request that would reshape the medieval world. They were knights, men of noble birth, who had crossed mountains and seas to reach the holy city, who had seen the violence that faith could inspire and the chaos that followed victory. But they came not seeking glory or plunder. They came seeking permission to protect pilgrims along the dangerous roads between the coast and Jerusalem. A humble mission for men who could have claimed lands and titles in the newly conquered territories. King Baldwin granted their request, but he granted something more, something that history has never adequately explained. He gave these 9 knights quarters beneath Al-Aqsa Mosque, in the vaulted chambers that sat directly above the ruins of Solomon's temple. The location was not merely symbolic. It was perhaps the most sacred ground in the Holy Land, the site where Jewish tradition held that the Ark of the Covenant had rested, where Solomon's wisdom had been encoded in the very architecture of his great temple, where mysteries accumulated across millennia waited in the darkness beneath accumulated rubble. The 9 knights descended into those chambers, and for 9 years they scarcely emerged. The official history tells us they were guarding pilgrims, but no records survive of any pilgrims they actually protected during those early years. No accounts describe them patrolling the dangerous roads. Instead, the fragments that survive suggest something entirely different. Excavation, digging, the patient removal of earth and stone from chambers that had been sealed since the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. They were not guarding the roads above. They were exploring the darkness below. We enter those chambers now in imagination, following worn limestone steps downward into air that grows cooler with each descent. The light from above fades, oil lamps flicker against walls that have not been seen by human eyes for 1,000 years. The knights move carefully, reverently, understanding that they walk where prophets walked, where kings knelt, where the divine presence itself was said to have dwelled in the days before exile scattered Israel across the nations. The space opens into vaulted chambers, their architecture still visible despite centuries of accumulated debris. The knights set their lamps in niches carved by hands that have been dust for millennia. They begin the slow work of excavation, not the hurried digging of treasure seekers, but the careful, methodical removal of material that might hide something precious beneath. They sift through rubble that contains fragments of the First Temple period, through soil that holds memories of Solomon's craftsmen, through darkness that has held its secrets since Roman soldiers burned the Second Temple and sent smoke rising over Jerusalem like a funeral prayer. What did they find? The question has haunted historians and seekers for 9 centuries. The Templars left no record of their excavations, no inventory of discoveries, no account of what those 9 years of digging revealed. But something happened in those chambers beneath the Temple Mount. Something transformed 9 obscure knights into the nucleus of an order that would command the respect of popes and the fear of kings. Something gave them knowledge or resources, or both, that allowed them to emerge from Jerusalem as founders of the most powerful organization medieval Christendom would ever know. The theories multiply across centuries of speculation. Some believe they found treasure, the gold and sacred vessels hidden before the Roman destruction. Wealth that would explain the Templars' sudden rise to financial power. Others believe they found documents, texts containing secret teachings, perhaps the lost Gospels, perhaps writings that revealed truths the Church could not acknowledge. Still others believe they found the Ark itself, or fragments of it, or knowledge of where it had been hidden when the temple fell. And some believe they found something harder to categorize. Knowledge, perhaps, of sacred geometry, of the mysteries that Solomon himself was said to have possessed, of secrets encoded in the temple's very architecture that could be read only by those who knew how to look. The silence around their discovery is itself significant. The Templars were not merely secretive. They were bound by vows that prohibited the revelation of their inner mysteries. The rule of the order, compiled shortly after their founding, contains passages that hint at secret rituals, at knowledge reserved for the inner circle, at truths that could be transmitted only to those who had proven themselves worthy. What happened in the darkness beneath the Temple Mount was never committed to writing, never shared with outsiders, never revealed even under the torture that would eventually extract so many confessions from Templar lips. The 9 knights who descended into those chambers were ordinary men. Hugues de Payens, Godfrey de Saint-Omer, and 7 others whose names survive only in fragments. They had families they had left behind, lands they had abandoned, futures they had surrendered to Crusade's uncertain promise. But the men who emerged 9 years later were transformed. They had seen something, found something, understood something that separated them from ordinary knights forever after. When they finally ascended from the darkness, blinking in Jerusalem's harsh light, they carried with them the seeds of an empire. Within years, they had the blessing of Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential churchman of his age. Within decades, they had papal recognition, exemption from local authority, the right to build their own churches and collect their own tithes. Within a century, they commanded fortresses across the known world, managed the finances of kings, fielded armies that struck fear into Muslim and Christian alike. But the question of what they found remains unanswered. The chambers beneath the Temple Mount have been only partially explored by modern archaeology. Political and religious sensitivities prevent full excavation of ground sacred to 3 faiths. What secrets those chambers might still hold, what the Templars might have discovered there, remains wrapped in the same darkness that surrounded the 9 knights as they knelt in silence beneath Solomon's ruined temple, beginning a mystery that would outlive them all. The chapter closes not with answers, but with the image of men ascending from darkness, carrying something invisible, knowledge or relics or secrets or perhaps nothing more than the profound experience of having touched the sacred directly, of having knelt where angels were said to have walked, of having inherited something from Solomon's temple that would shape their order, until its final flames. Beneath the golden dome that catches Jerusalem's morning light. Beneath the shrine that Muslims call the noble sanctuary and Jews call the Temple Mount, lie chambers that reach back beyond recorded memory, spaces where sacred history accumulated across millennia before the Templars ever arrived. To understand what the Knights sought in those depths, we must first understand what made this ground so precious, why this particular hilltop became the axis around which three great faiths would revolve, why men would cross continents and sacrifice everything to kneel upon its stones. The hill was sacred before Jerusalem was Jewish, before Israel was a nation, before Abraham heard the voice that called him from Ur. Ancient traditions speak of this place as the foundation stone of the world, the point from which creation spread outward like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Here, according to legend older than writing, the divine first touched the earthly, establishing a connection that would pulse through subsequent ages like a heartbeat that the faithful could still detect if they listened with sufficient stillness. When Solomon built his temple here in the 10th century before Christ, he was not merely constructing a religious building. He was creating a machine for connecting heaven and earth, a structure whose every measurement and material was chosen according to principles that tradition attributed to divine instruction. The temple was not designed by human architects alone. According to the Hebrew texts, Solomon received his plans from sources beyond ordinary understanding. Some say from the wisdom that God granted in response to the young king's prayer. Others say from beings the texts call watchers, entities who taught humanity arts and sciences that would otherwise have remained unknown. The temple's dimensions were sacred geometry made manifest. Its proportions encoded mathematical relationships that modern analysis has connected to principles found in nature itself. The spiral of shells, the branching of trees, the ratios that govern growth and beauty throughout the created world. The craftsmen who built it were said to have worked in silence, their tools making no sound as they shaped stones that fit together without mortar, as though the temple assembled itself through intention rather than labor. At the temple's heart stood the Holy of Holies, a perfect cube of space where the Ark of the Covenant rested, that golden chest containing the tablets Moses had carried down from Sinai, the physical record of divine law, the most sacred object in Israelite tradition. The ark was not merely a container, but was itself a point of connection, a place where the divine presence was said to dwell between the wings of golden cherubim, where the high priest could approach once each year to receive guidance for the nation. This was the ground beneath which the Templars dug. This was the sacred architecture they sought to understand. This was the inheritance they believed they could claim if only they could penetrate the rubble that centuries of destruction had accumulated over Solomon's original foundations. The first temple fell to Babylonian invasion in 586 BC. The ark vanished from history during that destruction. Some say carried to Babylon, others say hidden by priests who knew the invasion was coming. Still others say transported by mysterious means to Ethiopia, where churches still claim to possess it. The second temple, rebuilt after exile, was magnificent, but lacked the ark, lacked the divine presence that had made the first temple's inner chamber so terrible and holy. When Roman soldiers destroyed the second temple in 70 AD, they found no ark, no tablets, no golden chest, only an empty chamber where once the holiest object in the world had rested. But the Templars believed something remained. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, not the Temple of Herod, who had renovated the second temple, but specifically Solomon's temple, the first and truest house of God. Their very name announced their intention. They were claiming inheritance from Solomon himself, from the king whose wisdom had been legendary, whose knowledge had extended to the command of spirits and the understanding of nature's secrets, whose temple had been built according to plans that encoded truths beyond ordinary architecture. The Templars adopted Solomon's symbols as their own. The seal of Solomon, 2 interlocking triangles forming a 6-pointed star, appeared on Templar documents and buildings. The temple's sacred geometry influenced Templar church construction. There are round churches echoing the curves of the dome of the rock that covered the chamber where the ark had rested. Their rituals contained references to Solomon's temple that suggested more than metaphorical connection, that hinted at transmission of actual knowledge from the ancient king to the medieval knights. We walk now through the underground spaces that the Templars explored, spaces that modern archaeology has only partially revealed. The chambers extend beneath the Temple Mount in directions that have never been fully mapped, their extent unknown, their contents largely unexplored. Israeli archaeologists have investigated portions through tunnels along the western wall, but the area directly beneath the dome of the rock remains off limits, sacred to Muslims, politically impossible to excavate. What might still rest in those unexplored chambers, documents, artifacts, the ark itself, remains a question that cannot be answered by any means available to contemporary scholarship. The Templars spent 9 years in exploration of spaces that we cannot examine, seeking knowledge that we cannot verify, finding whatever they found in darkness that has closed again behind them. When they emerged, they carried Solomon's legacy with them. Not necessarily physical objects, though perhaps those too, but certainly the conviction that they had inherited something precious from the ancient king, that they were continuing work that had been interrupted for millennia, that the temple's secrets were now their secrets to gust and, perhaps, to complete. The chapter fades with the understanding that the Temple Mount holds layers of sacred memory beyond archaeological recovery, that the Templars who knelt in its depths were touching something that transcends historical documentation, that the questions raised by their excavations cannot be answered through ordinary historical methods. The temple remembered Solomon, and the Templars claimed that memory as their inheritance, carrying it forward into an order whose mysteries would eventually rival the temple's own. In the cool chambers where Templar knights received their initiation, where candles flickered against the stone walls and Latin words echoed like prayers, a transformation occurred that created warriors unlike any the medieval world had known. The making of a Templar was not merely military training. It was spiritual death and rebirth, the creation of a new kind of man who belonged neither entirely to the world of monks nor to the world of soldiers, but to a third realm where prayer and warfare merged into single purpose. The candidate approached the ceremony having already surrendered everything. He had disposed of his lands, distributed his wealth, severed the ties that bound him to family and feudal obligation. He came to the order empty-handed, owning nothing, claiming nothing, ready to receive the identity that the order would grant him in exchange for the self he had abandoned. This surrender was absolute, not the temporary renunciation of a crusader who might return home to resume his former life, but permanent transformation from which there was no return except through death or disgrace. The chamber was spare, deliberately humble despite the order's growing wealth. The simplicity was theological statement. The Templars might manage fortunes, but individual knights possessed nothing, desired nothing, owned nothing except the equipment necessary for their sacred warfare. The contrast between corporate wealth and individual poverty was fundamental to the order's identity. They were stewards of resources devoted to sacred purpose, not owners who might be corrupted by personal attachment to material things. The candidate knelt before the presiding master, surrounded by brother knights who had undergone this same transformation, who now witnessed the ritual they remembered from their own initiation. The questions began. Formal inquiries, ensuring that the candidate understood what he was surrendering, that he came freely without hidden obligation, that no wife waited for his return, that no debts remained unpaid, that his body bore no hidden disease that would make him unfit for the warrior life he was embracing. Then came the vows, poverty, the surrender of all personal property, the acceptance that everything the knight would use, or wear or wield, belonged to the order, not to him. The white mantle he would receive was not his possession, but the order's livery, identifying him as their servant, their instrument, their expendable soldier in the eternal war between light and darkness. Chastity, the renunciation of sexual relations, of marriage, of the family that might divide loyalties or create attachments that would weaken commitment to sacred duty. The Templars would become brothers, not through blood, but through vow. Their family, the order itself, their inheritance, the tradition they served, their descendants, the knights who would follow them into battle generations hence. Obedience, the surrender of individual will to the order's command, the acceptance that superiors knew better than individual knights what sacred purpose required, the agreement to go where sent and do what ordered, without question or complaint. The Templar belonged not to himself, but to the hierarchy that directed the order's mission. The vow spoken, the candidate received the mantle, white wool marked with the distinctive red cross that would identify Templars across Christendom and beyond. The white represented purity, the absolute commitment to sacred purpose that the vows had established. The red represented blood. The blood of Christ, whose service the order claimed, the blood the knight was prepared to shed in that service. The blood that connected him to every brother who had worn this mantle before, and every brother who would wear it after. The transformation was complete. The man who had entered the chamber no longer existed. In his place stood a Templar knight, dead to the world, yet more alive in purpose than he had ever been, sworn to serve until death released him from vows that admitted no other release. The psychological impact of this transformation was profound. The Templars fought with a ferocity that terrified both their enemies and their allies, rushing into battles where other knights hesitated, accepting death with a calm that seemed almost elusive. This fearlessness was not madness, but was the natural consequence of their vows. They had already died to the world, already surrendered everything that ordinary men feared to lose, already accepted that their individual lives mattered less than the sacred purpose they served. A man who has already given up everything cannot be threatened with loss. A man who has already accepted death cannot be intimidated by mortality. But the transformation also created men capable of keeping secrets. The vow of obedience extended to silence about the order's inner workings, about rituals that candidates witnessed but could not describe to outsiders, about knowledge that was transmitted only to those who had proven themselves worthy through years of service and testing. The Templars became renowned for their secrecy, for their refusal to discuss their internal affairs, for the impenetrable silence they maintained about mysteries that outsiders could only imagine. This silence would eventually condemn them. When accusations of heresy arose, when inquisitors demanded explanation of Templar rituals, the knights found themselves unable to defend practices they were sworn not to reveal. The same obedience that made them formidable warriors made them vulnerable to charges they could not answer. For to answer would have required breaking vows that no true Templar could break, that defined them more essentially than any accusation could touch. The chapter closes with the image of the newly made knight standing in dawn light, wearing the cross that proclaimed him dead to the world, yet somehow more intensely present than before, ready to serve a purpose he could not fully understand, carrying secrets he could not share, transformed into something that medieval Europe had never seen before and would never see again after the Order's destruction erased this particular path to sacred warfare from the possibilities available to seeking souls. Across the medieval world, a network of Templar commanderies spread like stars mapped onto earthly geography, connected by roads that carried more than pilgrims and more than soldiers. Within decades of their founding, the Templars had become something unprecedented, an international organization answering to no earthly king, managing wealth that exceeded the treasuries of nations, operating a financial system so sophisticated that modern banking still echoes its innovations. The knights who had sworn themselves to poverty somehow became the bankers of Christendom. The paradox was built into the Order's structure from early days. Individual Templars owned nothing, but the Order itself could own everything. And did. Donations poured in from across Europe as nobles sought spiritual credit through supporting the sacred warriors. Land grants accumulated, farms and vineyards, forests and fisheries, mills and manor houses. Each donation was accepted in the Order's name, not in the name of any individual knight, maintaining the distinction between corporate wealth and personal poverty that the rule required. But land was only the beginning. The order soon discovered that their network of commanderies, fortified establishments spread across every Christian kingdom, created possibilities that transcended agriculture. A knight could deposit gold in Paris and receive a letter of credit that could be redeemed for equivalent value in Jerusalem. A merchant could entrust his wealth to the temple before undertaking dangerous pilgrimage, knowing it would be waiting for him if he returned, would be administered according to his wishes if he did not. A king could borrow from the Templars when war depleted his treasury, confident that the order's resources exceeded his own. We follow the roads between commanderies now, understanding how the network functioned. The commandery in London held accounts for nobles across England. The commandery in Paris served French aristocracy with similar services. The temple in Acre was hub for Eastern operations, processing the wealth that crusading generated, ransoms, trade profits, donations from those who had fulfilled their pilgrim vows. Between these nodes, couriers traveled with documents rather than gold, carrying letters that could transfer value across thousand-mile distances without risking physical transport of treasure through lawless territories. The system was banking before banking existed. The Templars invented or reinvented from ancient sources financial instruments that would not reappear until Italian merchants developed them centuries later. Letters of credit, deposit banking, foreign exchange, estate management. The Templars performed all these services and more, charging fees that added to the order's growing wealth while providing genuine value to those who used their services. The wealth accumulated beyond anyone's ability to calculate. The order owned over 870 castles, commanderies, and preceptories across Europe and the Holy Land. Their fleet controlled Mediterranean shipping routes, their agricultural operations fed cities, their financial services moved the money that funded wars and built cathedrals. By the mid-13th century, the French crown itself was permanently in debt to the temple, dependent on Templar loans to fund royal operations. Increasingly resentful of dependence on an organization that answered only to Rome. This werewolf raised questions that the order's enemies would eventually weaponize. How could knights sworn to poverty command such riches? The official answer, that the wealth belonged to the order, not to individuals, satisfied canon lawyers, but troubled popular imagination. Rumors spread of treasure beyond accounting, of secret vaults beneath the Paris temple, where gold accumulated in quantities that exceeded the minting capacity of kingdoms. Some whispered that the Templars had discovered Solomon's treasure beneath the Temple Mount, that their wealth came from hoards accumulated across Israelite centuries, rather than from mere donations and commerce. Other explanations were darker still. The Templars' Eastern connections, their long residence in the Holy Land, their documented contacts with Muslim scholars and leaders, their possession of texts in languages few Europeans could read, suggested to suspicious minds that their knowledge might include secrets from sources that Christianity would not acknowledge. The transformation of base metal into gold was theoretical possibility in medieval thought. The philosopher's stone that alchemists sought. Had the Templars found it? Had their years beneath the Temple Mount revealed alchemical secrets that turned their vaults into sources of endless wealth. The truth was probably simpler and simultaneously more remarkable. The Templars had created a multinational corporation in an age that had no concept for such an entity, had developed financial instruments that generated genuine profit from services that created genuine value, had accumulated wealth through means that were innovative rather than magical. But this truth was harder to accept than the legends, and the legends would contribute to the accusations that eventually destroyed the order. The wealth that seemed bottomless during the order's height would prove an invitation to plunder when protection wavered. King Philip IV of France, crushed by debts he could not pay, watched the Templar treasure with eyes that calculated more than spiritual merit. The gold that had built an empire would become the motive for the empire's destruction. The treasure that had risen from nothing returning to mystery in the darkness of a single October night. The chapter fades with gold gleaming in the light of torches, with the weight of wealth that blessed and cursed in equal measure, with the understanding that the Templars' financial genius was perhaps their most enduring legacy, and simultaneously the most dangerous gift they possessed. In the harbour towns, where Templar ships rocked gently against stone quays, where salt wind carried the scent of distant shores, mysteries accumulated that maritime history has never fully charted. The Order maintained a substantial fleet, galleys and transport vessels that connected their commanderies across the Mediterranean, that carried pilgrims and cargo and warriors between Europe and the Holy Land. But whispers persisted of voyages that extended beyond known waters, of ships that sailed Atlantic routes that official history would not acknowledge for centuries yet. The Templars' principal Atlantic port was La Rochelle, on the western coast of France. Here, they maintained shipyards and warehouses, a fortified harbour from which their vessels could sail north to England and Scotland, or south to Portugal and beyond. The port's Atlantic orientation was unusual for an order whose primary mission lay in the Mediterranean and Holy Land, unless that mission extended to destinations that the order never publicly acknowledged. We stand on the quays of La Rochelle in imagination, watching Templar ships prepare for departure. The vessels are sturdy and seaworthy, built for Atlantic swells rather than Mediterranean calms. Their design incorporates innovations that seem advanced for their era, keels that provide stability in rough seas, rigging that allows sailing closer to the wind than contemporary vessels could manage. The crews include brothers from the Order's maritime commanderies, men whose navigational knowledge was accumulated across generations of seafaring. Where did these ships sail? The official record shows routine voyages, transport of personnel and supplies between Templar holdings, occasional naval operations in support of crusading ventures, commercial shipping that generated revenue for the Order's treasury. But the official record is incomplete, and the gaps have invited centuries of speculation. Some researchers point to Templar maps that allegedly showed coastlines unknown to their contemporaries, Atlantic islands that appear on no other charts of the period, continental margins that suggest knowledge of lands that Europeans would not officially discover until centuries later. The evidence for such maps is fragmentary and contested, but the persistence of the claims suggests something genuine lurking beneath the legend. The Templars had connections to Norse seafaring traditions through their Scottish commanderies, through their contacts with Scandinavian kingdoms, where memory of Atlantic voyages survived from the Viking Age. The Norsemen had reached North American shores around 1000 AD. This is documented historical fact, confirmed by archaeological evidence at Lancey Oaks Meadows in Newfoundland. The knowledge of those voyages did not die with the original explorers, but persisted in sagas and sailing directions that the Templars might have accessed. More intriguing are the claims of Templar presence in locations where medieval Europeans should not have been. Stones carved with crosses resembling Templar insignia have been reported in New England, in Nova Scotia, in locations that suggest pre-Columbian European visits. A tower in Newport, Rhode Island, displays architecture that some researchers identify as Templar construction, though others attribute it to later colonial building. Carvings at Rosslyn Chapel, built after the Order's fall, but by a family with deep Templar connections, include plants that appear to be American maize and aloe, species unknown in Europe until after Columbus. The evidence is not conclusive. Each claimed artifact or anomaly has alternative explanations that do not require pre-Columbian Atlantic crossings. The Newport Tower might be a colonial windmill. The Rosslyn carvings might be artistic convention rather than botanical accuracy. The stones might be coincidence or misidentification or hoax. But the persistence of such claims across centuries of investigation suggests that something underlies the legend, even if the something is only the conviction that the Templars possessed knowledge that exceeded their documented capabilities. What is certain is that the Templar fleet vanished on the night of the arrests. When Philip IV's forces seized the Paris Temple on October 13, 1307, the Order's ships were not in port. They had sailed, some say warned by the sympathizers within the French government. Others say following standing orders for just such an emergency. Where they sailed has never been established. The ships that should have been captured, that should have been added to royal inventory, along with other Templar assets, simply disappeared from history. Some traditions claim they sailed north to Scotland, where Robert the Bruce, excommunicated and therefore technically beyond papal authority, provided refuge for fleeing Templars. The Battle of Bannockburn, where Bruce's forces defeated the English in 1314, allegedly included Templar knights whose military expertise turned the tide. The subsequent establishment of Scottish Freemasonry, with its claimed Templar inheritance, might represent the continuation of the order under different guise. Others claim the ships sailed west, carrying treasure and refugees to distant lands where persecution could not reach, establishing communities in locations that the Order had secretly visited during its years of maritime activity. The stories cannot be confirmed, but they cannot be entirely dismissed either. Not when so much about the Templars' final days remains wrapped in the same secrecy that characterized their entire existence. The chapter closes with ships disappearing into Atlantic mist, with horizons that might hold truth, or might hold only the dreams of those who cannot accept that some mysteries have no solutions. The Templar fleet sailed into history's silence and never returned, rising from the Scottish landscape like a stone dream frozen in time. Rosslyn Chapel holds secrets encoded in its walls that have resisted 5 centuries of interpretation. The chapel was built between 1446 and 1484, more than a century after the Templars' official destruction. Yet its symbolism connects so persistently to Templar tradition that many believe it was designed as a repository for knowledge that the order had carried through its years of suppression. The Sinclair family who built Rosslyn had documented connections to the Templars. Their ancestors had testified at Templar trials, had maintained relationships with the order during its years of operation, had allegedly provided refuge for brothers fleeing the persecution. The family's seat at Rosslyn was already associated with Templar presence. Legend spoke of Templar treasure buried somewhere on the grounds, of secret chambers beneath the castle that awaited discovery. The chapel they built was unlike any other church of its era. Where Gothic architecture typically moved upward toward light, Rosslyn seemed to pull downward into mystery. The interior was so dense with carved symbolism that the eye could not rest, every surface covered with figures and patterns, with angels and demons, with foliage and faces, with geometric designs whose meanings have never been fully decoded. We enter the chapel now in imagination, allowing eyes to adjust to the amber light filtering through windows that seem too small for the space they illuminate. The apprentice pillar rises in the choir, its spiraling stone carved with a complexity that seems impossible for medieval tools. Wrapped vines climbing the column in mathematical spirals that encode relation that modern analysts are still exploring. Legend says the master mason designed the pillar but traveled to Rome before carving it, returning to find his apprentice had completed the work more beautifully than the master could have achieved. In jealous rage, the master killed the apprentice with a blow from his mallet, a story that echoes the central myth of Freemasonry with its murdered master builder. The carving extends across every available surface. More than 100 green men peer from foliage throughout the chapel, their faces emerging from vegetation in a motif that connects to pre-Christian traditions of death and rebirth. Angels play musical instruments whose design has allowed modern researchers to decode what may be a complete musical composition encoded in stone. Demons clutch at sinners in scenes of judgment. Knights ride across cornices in processions whose destinations remain unclear. And among the foliage appear plants that should not be there. The carvings include clear representations of maize, corn cobs with their distinctive rows of kernels, rendered with botanical accuracy that suggests the carver had seen actual specimens. Maize was unknown in Europe until Columbus brought it from the Americas after 1492. Rosslyn Chapel was completed before Columbus sailed. The presence of maize in the carvings suggests one of 3 possibilities. The chapel was carved later than documented history indicates. The carvers had remarkable prophetic ability. or someone connected to Rosslyn had access to American plants before Columbus made them officially available. The same problem appears with the representations that some identify as aloe, another American plant unknown in medieval Europe. The botanical identifications are debated. Perhaps the carving represents stylized wheat. Perhaps they show Mediterranean plants that superficially resemble American species. But the debate itself is significant. 5 centuries after the chapel's construction, scholars cannot agree on what its carvings depict, cannot decode the symbolism that covers every surface, cannot determine whether Rosslyn is elaborate artistic fancy or encoded transmission of genuine secrets. Beneath the chapel, tradition holds, lie chambers that have never been excavated. Ground-penetrating radar has confirmed the presence of voids beneath the floor, spaces that match the dimensions of the chapel above, that could contain whatever the builders chose to deposit there. Exploration has been repeatedly proposed and repeatedly denied. The Sinclair family and Scottish authorities unwilling to disturb what has remained undisturbed for 5 centuries. What might those chambers hold? Theories multiply beyond counting. The Templar treasure, carried north by the fleeing fleet, deposited beneath the chapel that the Sinclair family built to protect it. Documents from the Jerusalem excavations, texts too dangerous to reveal, preserved against a future that might be ready to receive them. The mummified bodies of Templar masters lay to rest in sacred ground when ordinary cemeteries refused them. The Holy Grail itself, whatever the Grail might actually be, cup or bloodline or document or something that cannot be named in ordinary language, or perhaps nothing at all. Perhaps the voids are empty, or hold only construction debris, or contain the expected burials of Sinclair family members, rather than exotic treasures from suppressed orders. The mystery persists precisely because the chambers remain sealed, because imagination can fill their darkness with whatever imagination desires. The chapel stands in evening light, its stone glowing amber against the Scottish sky, holding its secrets with the patience of stone that has waited 5 centuries and can wait 5 more. What the builders encoded in their carvings, what they buried beneath their floor, what they knew and chose to express in symbol rather than plain language. These questions hang in the chapel's air like incense smoke, unanswered, perhaps unanswerable, yet still alive for anyone willing to stand in that carved space and listen for the whisper of transmission from ages that knew more than they could say. On the morning of Friday, October 13th, 1307, dawn broke over France to reveal the most coordinated mass arrest in medieval history. Across the kingdom, royal officers opened sealed orders that had been distributed weeks earlier, with instructions not to break the seals until the appointed date. The orders commanded the arrest of every Templar knight within the realm. Hundreds of men seized simultaneously in a dawn raid, whose secrecy had been maintained so perfectly that the Templars, despite their legendary intelligence networks, were taken completely by surprise. The coordination was unprecedented. Medieval communication was slow and unreliable. Yet Philip IV's administration had managed to synchronize arrests across hundreds of miles. had maintained silence despite involving thousands of officers and soldiers, had achieved tactical surprise against an organization renowned for its information gathering. The arrests themselves were testimony to the efficiency of Philip's government and to the depth of his determination to destroy the order that had refused to bend to his will. We follow the royal soldiers through the pre-dawn darkness, watching them surround Templar commanderies, seal exits, wait for the signal that would begin the operation. In Paris, the temple itself was the primary target, the great fortress that housed the order's treasury, that had served as the kingdom's bank, that held gold Philip desperately needed to pay the debts his wars had accumulated. The soldiers approached with weapons drawn, uncertain what resistance they might encounter, knowing only that they were about to arrest the most formidable warriors in Christendom. The resistance never came. The Templars, awakened from sleep, found themselves surrounded before they could organize defense. Some attempted to fight and were subdued or killed. Most surrendered in bewildered shock, unable to understand how the kingdom they had served could turn upon them with such sudden violence. By noon, the arrest was complete. Nearly every Templar in France was in chains. The charges read against them were shocking beyond imagination. The Templars were accused of heresy in forms that attacked Christianity at its very foundation. They were said to deny Christ at their initiation ceremonies, to spit upon the cross, to worship an idol called Baphomet, to engage in homosexual rituals, to practice magic and sorcery learned from the infidels they had supposedly fought. Each charge was calculated to maximize horror, to transform Christendom's most respected warriors into its most reviled heretics. The confessions began within days, confessions extracted through torture that the Inquisition had perfected over generations of heresy hunting. The strappado suspended men from their arms until shoulders dislocated. The rack stretched bodies until joints separated. Fire was applied to the soles of feet. Starvation and sleep deprivation broke down resistance that physical pain could not overcome. Within weeks, Templars across France were confessing to crimes that defied belief. Were the confessions true? The question has haunted historians for 7 centuries. Under torture, men will confess to anything. This principle was understood even in the medieval period, when courts distinguished between voluntary confession and confession extracted under duress. But the consistency of some confessions, the specific details that appeared in testimonies from knights who had not communicated with each other, suggested to some that the accusations touched genuine secrets, however distorted by the context of torture and leading questions. The specific accusation regarding Baphomet remains particularly mysterious. The name itself defies satisfactory explanation. Perhaps a corruption of Muhammad, reflecting Christian fears of Islamic influence. Perhaps a version of baptism of wisdom in garbled Greek. Perhaps something else entirely. The descriptions of the idol varied wildly. Sometimes a head with 3 faces, sometimes a cat, sometimes a bearded skull, sometimes something with female features. The variations suggested either that different Templars saw different things, or that the inquisitors were recording confused attempts to describe experiences that did not fit ordinary categories. What the Templars actually practiced in their secret ceremonies, if they practiced anything beyond the ordinary rituals that other religious orders maintained, cannot be determined from the trial records. Confessions extracted under torture prove only that human beings will say what they must to make pain stop. The accusations prove only that Philip IV and his allies were willing to deploy any weapon against an order they were determined to destroy. The truth remains buried beneath layers of pain and propaganda, as inaccessible now as the vaults beneath the temple that the royal officers found disappointingly empty of the treasure they had expected. The chapter closes in darkness, the darkness of dungeon cells where Templar knights awaited trials whose outcomes were predetermined, the darkness of October morning when dawn revealed betrayal, the darkness of history that has never been fully illuminated despite centuries of scholarship. The Friday that darkness fell cast its shadow across Western imagination permanently, establishing October 13th as a date of ill omen, associating the Templars forever with secrets that their destruction ensured would never be revealed. Among the confessions extracted under torture, one image recurs with disturbing consistency. The Templars were accused of worshipping a mysterious head, an idol that watched from darkness during their secret ceremonies, that some called Baphomet, though none could agree on what the name meant or what the object actually was. The head has haunted Templar scholarship ever since, representing either the Order's genuine heresy or the Inquisitor's determined imagination, or perhaps something between these extremes that historical method cannot reach. The trial records describe the head in various terms. Some Templars confess to seeing a bearded male face, carved or mummified, that was brought forth during chapter meetings and accorded reverence. Others described a head with 3 faces, or a head that was female, or a head made of metal rather than bone. Still others said they had heard of the head, but had never seen it, that it was reserved for the highest-ranking brothers, that ordinary knights knew of its existence only through rumor. The variations might indicate fabrication, inquisitors leading confused prisoners toward predetermined conclusions, the specific details varying because they were being invented on the spot, rather than remembered from actual experience. But the variations might also indicate genuine confusion about something that actually existed, an object or practice that different witnesses experienced differently, that was deliberately obscured even within the order, that resisted clear description because it did not fit categories available to medieval minds. We approach the mystery carefully, understanding that certainty is impossible across 7 centuries of intervening darkness. The head might have been nothing, an invention of inquisitors seeking scandalous charges that would justify predetermined verdicts. The head might have been a reliquary, a skull or head of a saint, accorded veneration that was standard practice in medieval Christianity, but was misrepresented by accusers seeking to transform piety into heresy. The head might have been something stranger, an artifact from the Temple Mount excavations, an object that the Templars themselves did not fully understand, that they preserved because its origin was sacred even if its nature was obscure. Some researchers have connected Baphomet to the Shroud of Turin, the linen cloth bearing an image of a crucified man that some believe to be Christ's burial shroud. The Templars are documented to have possessed such a cloth in the 13th century, displaying it during ceremonies. When folded, the shroud shows only the face, a bearded male visage that could match descriptions of Baphomet. If the shroud was what the Templars were venerating, the image of Christ himself, preserved on his burial cloth, then the heresy charge was monstrous injustice. The transformation of the order's most sacred relic into evidence of their damnation. Other researchers connect Baphomet to severed heads that figure in Celtic and pre-Christian European traditions, sacred heads associated with prophecy and protection, whose veneration might have survived in folk practices that the Templars absorbed during their centuries of operation. The cult of the head was widespread in ancient Europe, and the Templars recruited from populations where such traditions remained alive beneath Christian overlay. A syncretic practice combining Christian devotion with older forms of veneration was certainly possible, though whether it actually occurred remains unprovable. The name itself resists analysis. Baphomet might derive from Muhammad, the medieval European name for Muhammad, reflecting the persistent accusation that the Templars had converted to Islam during their Eastern sojourn. The linguistic transformation is problematic, but medieval European fear of Islam was real, and accusations of crypto-Islam were standard weapons against groups the Church wished to destroy. Alternatively, Baphomet might derive from Greek words meaning baptism of wisdom, or absorption into wisdom, suggesting Gnostic influence rather than Islamic conversion. The etymology cannot be definitively resolved. What is certain is that Baphomet survived the Templars' destruction to become a major figure in Western occult tradition. The 19th century occultist Eliphas Levi created the iconic image still associated with the name, a goat-headed figure with wings and female breasts, combining male and female, human and animal, pointing upward and downward simultaneously. This image has nothing to do with the medieval trial records, but it has become what modern imagination sees when Baphomet is invoked. The head that the Templars were accused of worshipping, whatever it was or wasn't, has become something larger than any historical artifact could be. It represents the Order's impenetrable secrecy, the mysteries that died with the brothers who were tortured into confessing crimes that may or may not have resembled their actual practices. The head watches still from the darkness of history, its features shifting depending on who looks, its meaning changing depending on what the seeker hopes or fears to find. The chapter closes with eyes adjusting to darkness, searching for something that may or may not be present, something that has watched from the shadows of Western imagination for 7 centuries and shows no sign of resolving into clarity. The head remains, whether real or imagined, whether sacred or sinful, eternally ambiguous, eternally fascinating, eternally beyond the reach of historical method to finally and fully explain. On March 18, 1314, 7 years after the Dawn arrests that began the Order's destruction, Jacques de Molay was led to a platform on an island in the Seine where a pyre had been prepared for his execution. He was old now, 70 years at least, broken by years of imprisonment and torture, the last Grand Master of an order that had commanded the respect of Christendom. He had confessed under torture, recanted his confession, been returned to torture, confessed again in an endless cycle that had finally brought him to this moment when flames would settle the question permanently. The crowd gathered to watch was uncertain what to expect. Molay had been condemned as a relapsed heretic. Having confessed, then recanted, he had forfeited any possibility of mercy. The sentence was death by burning, the standard punishment for obdurate heresy, the fire that purified what could not be saved. Some in the crowd had come to see a heretic receive deserved punishment. Others had come to witness the end of an era, the final destruction of an order that had once seemed eternal. A few, perhaps, had come hoping to see something else. Courage, dignity, defiance that would redeem the Order's honor even in its final moments. They were not disappointed. The old knight was led to the stake and bound in place. The final opportunity was offered. Confession, repentance, acknowledgement that the charges had been true and the punishment just. The formula was familiar from hundreds of such executions. The expected response was submission, acceptance, a final prayer for mercy that acknowledged the Church's authority even as it consumed the heretic's body. Molay refused. Instead of the expected submission, the Grand Master raised his voice and proclaimed his innocence, the innocence of the Order, the falseness of the charges, the injustice of the proceedings that had destroyed the Templars. He had confessed under torture, he declared, but the confession was false. He had never denied Christ. The Order had never worshipped idols. The crimes for which he was dying were inventions of those who sought Templar wealth and feared Templar power. Then, according to the legend that immediately surrounded his death, he issued a curse. The words have been recorded in various forms across 7 centuries of retelling. In the most common version, Molay summoned Pope Clement V and King Philip IV to meet him before God's judgment seat within a year, to answer for the innocent blood they had shed, to face divine justice that human justice had denied. The words rang across the watching crowd, across the assembled officials, across the soldiers who held torches waiting to light the pyre. The torches were applied. The fire rose. What happened next passed into legend. Some accounts say Molay continued proclaiming the Order's innocence until smoke and flame made speech impossible. Others say he prayed aloud, committing his soul to God with the confidence of a man who knew himself innocent. Still others say he was silent at the end. His statement made, his courage demonstrated, his final witness complete. The fire consumed him. By evening, only ashes remained, ashes that were carefully collected and scattered on the Seine's dark waters, ensuring that no relics could be gathered, that no tomb could become pilgrimage site, that nothing physical would remain of the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar. But the curse remained. Pope Clement V died within 40 days. Some say from cancer that had long afflicted him. Others say from sudden illness that struck without warning. Still others say from the supernatural fulfillment of a dying man's prophetic judgment. His death was miserable. His final days marked by suffering that witnesses found difficult to watch. King Philip IV died within 8 months, thrown from his horse during a hunt, dying of injuries that should not have been fatal. His end so sudden that suspicion of poisoning arose despite the abhorrent accident. His heirs followed him quickly. Within 14 years, all 3 of his sons had died without male heirs, ending the direct Capetian line and plunging France into succession crisis. Coincidence or curse? History does not record supernatural intervention, but history does record the remarkable fulfillment of Mole's dying words, the destruction of those who had destroyed the Templars, the apparent vindication of an order whose innocence could never be proven, but whose enemies did not long survive their victory. The chapter closes with ashes scattering on dark water, with the smoke rising over Paris, with the echo of words that seemed impossible and yet came true. The fire consumed the Grand Master's body, but not his legacy, not the mystery that his order had accumulated across 2 centuries of sacred warfare and secret keeping. When Philip IV's officers finally entered the Paris Temple on October 13th, 1307, they expected to find wealth beyond counting, the accumulated treasure of 2 centuries, the gold that had made the Templars bankers to kings, the riches that had motivated the king's elaborate conspiracy. They found nearly empty vaults. The treasure was gone. Where had it gone? How had it been moved? The questions have never been answered, have generated theories that range from the plausible to the fantastic, have become perhaps the most enduring mystery surrounding the order's fall. The treasury should have been full. The Templars' financial operations continued normally until the day of the arrest. There was no indication that they suspected the trap being prepared, no evidence of unusual withdrawals or transfers, no sign that they were liquidating assets in anticipation of seizure. The treasury records showed vast holdings. The vaults showed almost nothing. Some explanations are mundane. Perhaps treasury was never as full as reputation suggested, the order's wealth existing more in property and credit than in physical gold. Perhaps Philip's officers were deceived by their expectations, finding less than they anticipated, simply because their anticipation was unrealistic. Perhaps the records were wrong, or the accounting was unclear, or the treasure was distributed across multiple locations that the arrests failed to secure. But other explanations persist. The timing suggests warning. The ships at La Rochelle sailed before the arrests, escaping the trap that caught the land-based Templars. Someone had advanced knowledge, had initiated evacuation procedures, while the sealed orders were still en route to officers throughout France. The source of the warning has never been identified. Perhaps a sympathizer within Philip's government. Perhaps a spy network that detected preparations despite extraordinary secrecy. Perhaps something less explicable. If warning came, treasure could have accompanied ships. The harbour at La Rochelle gave access to the Atlantic and destinations beyond Philip's reach. Scotland, Ireland, Portugal. The mysterious destinations that some believe the Templars had reached in previous voyages. Treasure loaded onto ships could have been carried anywhere, deposited in locations that remain undiscovered 7 centuries later. The legends multiply accordingly. Some say the treasure was buried beneath Rosslyn Chapel, protected by the Sinclair family who had maintained Templar connections. Some say it was carried to Oak Island off Nova Scotia, where elaborate underground structures have frustrated treasure hunters for over 200 years. Some say it was hidden in the caves of Rennes-le-Château in southern France, where 19th century discoveries by a local priest sparked theories connecting Templars to mysteries reaching back to the time of Christ. Others say the treasure was not gold at all, or not only gold, that the Templars' true wealth consisted of documents and artifacts from the Temple Mount excavations, of sacred relics that could not be valued in currency, of knowledge that was worth more than metal to those who understood its significance. This treasure, if it existed, could be preserved in archives rather than vaults, could be transmitted through teaching rather than inheritance, could survive even if no physical object remained. The search continues. Modern treasure hunters apply technology that medieval seekers lacked. Ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery, computer analysis of clues scattered through documents, and architecture. Each generation believes it will finally solve the mystery that previous generations failed to crack. Each generation finds fascinating hints and frustrating dead ends. The treasure's greatest value may lie precisely in its absence, in the seeking it has inspired, in the mystery it has maintained, in the refusal to be found that keeps the Templar legend alive. Found treasure would be catalogued and displayed, would become museum pieces rather than mystery. Unfound treasure remains possibility, remains the promise that somewhere, beneath some castle or chapel or island, the Templar's wealth waits for the seeker worthy to discover it. The chapter fades with empty vaults and full questions, with the understanding that the Templar treasure may never be found because the treasure is the seeking itself, the eternal pursuit of secrets that remain always just beyond reach. Long after the last Templar knight died in prison or exile or flames, their symbols continued appearing, carved into cathedral walls, encoded in Masonic ritual, displayed on tombstones and talismans across the Western world. The order was destroyed, but its iconography refused to die, persisting through centuries that transformed medieval knights into mythological figures, embodying everything that seekers project onto vanished mysteries. The red cross on white ground remained most recognizable, the symbol that had identified Templars across Christendom, that had struck fear into Muslim enemies and inspired Christian allies. The cross appeared on Masonic regalia, on the flags of organizations claiming Templar descent, on the merchandise that modern commerce produces for those fascinated by the order. The symbol's power lay in its simplicity and its history, its direct connection to warriors who had worn it into battle and worn it to their deaths. The skull and crossbones, associated with Templars through legends of initiation ceremonies, became symbol of both mortality and defiance, appearing on pirate flags, on military insignia, on Masonic memento mori that reminded initiates of death's inevitability. The specific origin is uncertain, but the association persists, connecting the Templars to every subsequent use of the image. The two knights on a single horse, the Order's original seal, representing the poverty that required sharing mounts, became symbol of brotherhood and sacrifice, of the unity that transcended individual identity. The image appears still in organizations claiming spiritual descent from the Templars, its meaning shifting from literal poverty to metaphorical solidarity. More complex symbolism encoded architectural spaces. The round churches that Templars built throughout Europe, modeled on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, created sacred geometry that initiated could read, while ordinary observers saw only unusual architecture. The proportions encoded relationships that connected earthly buildings to cosmic patterns, that transformed stone into teaching tool for those who possess the key to interpretation. Freemasonry claimed Templar inheritance most explicitly, developing degrees and rituals that presented themselves as continuation of suppressed knowledge. The historical connection remains debated. Some scholars see genuine transmission from Templars through Scotland to early Masonic lodges. Others see imaginative reconstruction that created tradition rather than preserving it. The debate itself may miss the point. Whether Freemasonry preserves authentic Templar secrets or invented compelling myths, the Masonic transmission ensured that Templar symbolism would survive into modernity, would continue speaking to seekers who found in ancient imagery something that contemporary symbols could not provide. The symbols outlasted their original context to become free-floating signifiers available for any meaning seekers wish to project. The Red Cross appears on the flags of organizations that have nothing to do with medieval knights. The imagery decorates websites and social media accounts of groups whose connection to historical Templars is entirely dual or imaginary. The symbols have been adopted by organizations whose values would horrify the actual medieval warriors. Hate groups and conspiracy theorists, and others who find in Templar mystique something that speaks to their particular obsessions. This appropriation demonstrates the symbol's power. They continue carrying charge after 7 centuries because they connect to something that historical explanation cannot fully reach, to the fascination with secret knowledge, with sacred violence, with orders that answer to higher authority than earthly power can command. The symbols speak to hungers that modernity does not satisfy, that persist despite, or because of, the rationalization that has stripped most ancient images of their numinous power. The chapter closes with symbols carved in stone, with images that have outlived the men who first wore them, with the understanding that the Templars' destruction ensured their immortality, that an order destroyed becomes eternal in ways that a surviving order could never achieve. In the final stillness of our journey, we return to the beginning, to Jerusalem, to the Temple Mount, to the chambers beneath sacred stone where 9 knights knelt in darkness nearly 1,000 years ago. We have followed their path from those depths to the heights of power, through the accumulation of wealth and the practice of mysteries, to the flames and accusations that ended their visible history. We have explored the legends that rose from their ashes, the symbols that survived their destruction, the seekers who have followed their trail across 7 centuries of fascination. But the mystery remains. What the Templars found beneath the Temple Mount, what they believed in their deepest rituals, what they carried into the night when the arrests began, what knowledge perished with them, and what knowledge was preserved. These questions have no certain answers. The silence that the Templars maintained about their inner workings continues through the centuries that have followed their fall, unbroken by scholarship, uninvaded by archaeology, undisturbed by the technologies that modernity has deployed against so many ancient secrets. This silence is itself significant. The Templars were men who could keep secrets, whose vows prohibited revelation even under torture, whose loyalty to the order exceeded their attachment to their own lives, whose discipline held firm through circumstances designed to shatter it. Whatever they knew, they took with them when they died. Whatever they preserved, they transmitted only to those they chose to trust. The silence is not absence of meaning, but is active concealment. The continued keeping of vows by men whose bodies have been dust for 7 centuries, but whose commitment to secrecy outlasts their flesh. We stand in the darkness beneath the Temple Mount, in chambers that modern archaeology has only partially explored. The spaces extend in directions that have not been mapped, that may hold discoveries that would rewrite history, or may hold only rubble and emptiness. The prohibition on excavation protects sensitivities that modern politics must respect. Sacred ground to multiple faiths, contested territory in conflicts that have no resolution in sight. The chambers remain sealed, not by Templar intention, but by circumstances that the Templars could not have anticipated. Their secrets protected by forces that operate independently of their will. What might still rest in those unexplored spaces? The possibility cannot be eliminated, however unlikely any specific theory may seem. The Ark of the Covenant, if it exists, was last seen in Solomon's temple on this site. Documents from the Second Temple period could have survived in the dry conditions beneath the stone. Artifacts from the Templar excavations might have been reburied when the Order realized they could not protect what they had found. The chambers hold possibilities that cannot be ruled out, that persist as possibility precisely because examination is impossible. The mystery feeds itself. Each generation of seekers adds new theories to the accumulation, new interpretations that build on or contradict earlier understandings. The Templars mean something different to 21st century minds than they meant to 19th century romantics, who understood them differently than 18th century Masons, who received a different tradition than Renaissance scholars. The object of fascination remains constant, but the fascination itself evolves, reflecting the needs and projections of each age that contemplates the enigma. Perhaps this is the Templars' greatest secret, that the secret itself is what matters, not any specific content it might contain. The seeking transforms seekers. The questions open minds in ways that answers would close. The mystery provides what certainty cannot. Endless invitation to explore, to wonder, to reach beyond what can be known toward what can only be approached. The silence holds. The chambers remain sealed. The questions persist without resolution. And in the stillness of this concluding moment, we understand that we have not solved the mystery of the Templars. We have only joined the centuries of seekers who have approached this darkness and found it beautiful, who have listened to this silence and found it speaking, who have recognized in the impenetrable secrecy of a suppressed medieval order something that speaks to hungers that modernity cannot satisfy. The Templars were warriors and bankers and monks. They were powerful and mysterious and ultimately destroyed. They kept secrets that they never revealed and died maintaining silence that continues through 7 centuries of inquiry. They became legend because their destruction ensured they could never become merely history, could never be reduced to documents and artifacts that exhaust their meaning, could never be fully explained, and therefore dismissed. The night deepens around us now. The torches that illuminated our journey begin to gutter. The sacred darkness that surrounds Solomon's ruined temple, that surrounds the chambers where 9 knights knelt so long ago, that surrounds the mysteries that the Templars carried and concealed. This darkness remains, patient and profound and eternal. The silence holds a secret. The secret remains. And we rest now, having traveled as far as travel can take us, understanding that the journey continues beyond where we can follow, that the mystery persists beyond what we can know, that the Templars wait still in the shadows of history, for seekers patient enough to listen without demanding answers, humble enough to approach without claiming certainty, wise enough to recognize that some secrets maintain their power precisely by remaining forever and completely kept. The silence surrounds us. The night is deep, and in that depth something watches. Sacred or sinful, real or imagined, ancient or eternal. Something that the Templars found and kept and carried into the darkness that consumed them and the darkness that continues after them without end.